Trusted cost planning and QS firm Slattery have just launched a carbon planning service for the property industry. With buildings producing 25% of Australia's emissions, this move marks another step in the industry's shift towards a net zero future. Joining us to explain what carbon planning is and how it works is Tom Dean, Director at Slattery. Thanks for joining us on The Urban Developer.
Thank you.
Now, let's just start with some context here. Why does a cost planning firm make a move into carbon planning?
For us, it was a pretty simple decision. The risk of not managing carbon in developments will start to become a cost of doing business. So we've seen that already with our clients. So whether it's payment through offsets, valuation of your assets, or reporting to shareholders, it's a cost of doing business. So therefore, it's a natural extension to our current advice as it's interlinked with capital cost and cost itself.
Makes sense. So how knowledgeable is the property sector generally about their carbon footprint and carbon planning?
Pretty big disparity actually amongst the subsectors of where you are in the industry. Some of the large engineering firms have been really leading the way in this space for a long time and pushing it. And the rest of us are catching up, really. So considering the property industry adapts pretty quickly, this will really start to make a big change in the next 2 to 5 years, and it will come.
So for those that don't have a deep understanding of this, when we refer to carbon planning, what are we actually referring to?
What we're talking about is the embodied carbon of a project and managing that through the process of design. To explain that, operational carbon is all the carbon used in running of the building. So purchasing electricity for your power, your heating, your lights, those sort of things. And that's a very mature space. A lot of ESD consultants and a lot of engineers are really owning that space. Separate to that, we're really focused on embodied carbon up front. So the carbon used in the production and the building of that building.
Right. And so what sort of changes then to design or construction is required to achieve lower embodied carbon?
The first step is for everyone to understand it. So the first step is education and understanding of what the biggest drivers of carbon in your development. And it's very similar to the principles of cost planning, what we do day to day. So an old adage of cost planning is 80% of the cost is in 20% of the item. So make sure you get that right and you get the answer right. It's exactly the same with embodied carbon. There's a couple of areas that the majority of embodied carbon comes from. So really focus on that, which are the really big, heavy items around substructure, your structure and facade. So if you look at making an efficient building and structure, look at the reuse of your building materials and your buildings, the supply chain of your materials and things like glazing ratio to external walls. Very similar principles to cost planning you look at for embodied carbon and reducing that.
Okay. And so give us some examples of where you can find those kind of cheapest and easiest and quickest gains from a carbon point of view.
Depending on what sort of building you're building, there's some very simple ones you can look at. We've delivered a project where everyone's really focused on the building and the car park was just a huge concrete asphalt car park that no one was focused on. Once we started doing carbon planning and worked out, hang on, we're spending all this time on this building, but we're not actually looking at it externally. There's some pretty easy, cheap wins, which doesn't cost you more, but really reduces your embodied carbon. But like not all buildings have car parks, so it's not always the best example. Things like reducing and reviewing your external walls. So your external wall breakup from glazing to solid is a good way to look at it, or changing materials from metal TUD to stud to timber stud. Yeah, there's a whole process that you can go through, and it's based on metrics and facts. That's what we want to get to. It's not based on our opinion. We're not ESD consultants, and we're not trying to be.
Right. Okay. So how viable for the various sectors across the industry is it to achieve a net zero building? And I guess which sectors kind of are at the front of the pack and which ones are lagging behind?
It is a big jump from a business to go from what you're doing now to being net zero in one go. You know, working out how viable it is depending on what your business as usual looks like. So the people who are ahead of the pack are tertiary education clients, the big universities. For them, it's not a big change. It's quite viable and they're looking at it now. But for some other clients, some other sectors, if you haven't started thinking about it, it will be a big step to go to net zero. So we think it's smarter to not like try to do everything in one go. It's more about understanding your buildings, and doing incremental changes. So we've got benchmarks for different types of buildings per meter squared, similar to cost. And it's saying, okay, on your previous development, it was this. How can we improve by 10%? How can we improve by 20%? Because I think that's the way the industry needs to look at it, is incremental improvements to achieve those figures.
Mm. What are the sectors that perhaps are sort of at the back of the pack? Which one is it you finding it most challenging to sort of get progress in?
I think everyone's interested. I think it will be the biggest change for people who build to sell apartments will be difficult, because you're not owning your assets, so you never really think about it as the long-term impacts. But that will change, and I think legislation will change that you have to start thinking about it. Key ones that people are very interested is like commercial, health. They're really hungry to understand more. They keep their assets for a long period of time, and they're usually institutional. And currently the way that you need to report to your shareholders, and that's going to change even more so in the future, is reporting to shareholders will impact on what you do in your developments.
Okay. And so how does Slattery approach carbon planning for property clients? I'm interested to understand how the cost planning and the carbon planning sort of work hand in hand.
Yeah, we approach it the same way as cost planning. So at the commencement of a project, you need to set a carbon budget, same as a cost budget. We've got a lot of benchmarks in terms of what other clients are doing, what other industries are doing. So you work out what's the meter squared cost benchmark or cost budget for that project. And then throughout the process, systematically checking against, how you're going against your carbon budget. So you get to the end of schematic design, you might do a cost plan and a carbon plan, and then you check how you go against your budget for cost and carbon. We think it's iterative to understand, okay, if you change this item in your design, what is the embodied carbon impact and what's the cost impact?
Okay. And what sort of clients are you working with currently?
Not surprisingly, the universities at the moment are leading in the space. They've got a large asset pool, which is aging. And so, and they're very much early adopters within the industry. So yeah, they're at the forefront, but health and commercial from our launch earlier this week are really hungry to know more. And they've really reached out to start to educate themselves on how this works.
Yeah, well, it's obviously something that's occurring around the world with various degrees of targets across the planet, and I think it's a very important part of our industry to embrace and adapt to, and very important work that you guys are doing there at Slattery. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Adam.